When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.
Welcome to You and the Law, a Chicago Bar Association program focusing on matters of law and policy for the general public as a matter of public service and education. Thanks for tuning in. We are very lucky to have Dean Erwin Chemerinsky joining us today to talk about the TikTok ban and litigation and opinions about it, and perhaps related First Amendment issues that come up. And I could spend a great deal of time providing some background on Professor Chemerinsky, although I'm going to turn it over to him to provide a little bit of what he thinks may be most relevant to our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us. Sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on your program. It's truly my honor and pleasure. I think what's most relevant is that I grew up in Chicago on the far south side. In fact, my first teaching job was at DePaul in Chicago, and I'm now the dean of the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. I've been here for 8 years. Before that, I spent 9 years as the founding dean of the law school at University of California, Irvine. Before that, I taught at Duke Law School and the University of Southern California. I said, starting with DePaul. My scholarship is about constitutional law, including I've written extensively about the First Amendment.
Sure, and I appreciate that, and that's a very brief background. You bring so much to the table that we really don't even have time to get into at the moment. But I will say, just by you know way of introduction, I reached out to you because I read what you had to say, sort of in real time, about what was going on about the TikTok ban and the opinions that came out. And it is still relevant and in the mix with many other things that are going on in our democracy that relate to rule of law and constitutional law. And certainly, I think there's been a flurry of First Amendment issues that have been quite pronounced, not just under Trump, I think escalated under Trump, but even the preceding administration. I think we saw some escalation in what First Amendment lawyers and those concerned about free speech would be attuned to. So why don't we jump right into the TikTok ban and the cases, the appellate and the Supreme Court opinions. However you want to jump into it, we can start there.
Well, I think we should start with the law that was passed by Congress in the spring of 2024. It's important to note that there was strong bipartisan support. It was signed by President Joe Biden. And what it essentially said was that TikTok could not continue to operate in the United States after January 19th unless it was sold from ByteDance to a non-Chinese company.
Mhm.
This got challenged in court. There are 173 million people in the United States who use TikTok. The lawsuit was brought on behalf of them and on behalf of those who post on TikTok. This is the first time the government's ever tried to ban an entire medium platform of communication. To make a long story short, on Friday, January 17th, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the federal law. TikTok briefly went dark on Saturday, January 18th. Almost then, President Trump said that he was going to suspend the law, and he did so. So TikTok came back, and President Trump said he was going to suspend the law for 75 days. We
Mhm.
should be clear he had no authority to do that. The law allowed a president to extend for a period of 90 days if there was substantial progress towards a sale. President Trump didn't claim there was substantial progress towards the sale. And when those 75 days expired, he extended it again. So
Right.
it's a strange situation. You have a law passed by Congress, upheld by the Supreme Court, but the president has effectively suspended the law.
Sure, sure. And the law we're talking about is known as the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, and you did mention it's novel, it's interesting, unique perhaps in a number of ways. Perhaps the principal way is that it's an entire platform medium that is subject to this, right? What's the significance of that for people who may not? Because we're in a new environment. Well, I don't know if it's new or not. It's developing this kind of technological information environment, which has got some nuances.
173 million people use TikTok.
Right.
To ban TikTok would have profound effect on their ability to receive information, and for those who post, their ability to communicate. I cannot think of any analog in American history where there's been such a major restriction on speech.
Hmm. Hmm. One of the interesting, issues about speech, it's obviously it's not it should ought not to be quote unquote classically a political issue, although it becomes a football in that regard. And it's sort of interesting that you know, um, with Trump's campaign and some of the media around that, there seemed to be a First Amendment, a pro First Amendment free speech sort of aspect to that, including whether it is actually this or not. Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, there was a lot of First Amendment and free speech discussion associated with that. But it's not, it goes sort of back and forth, and it's definitely bipartisan. I mean, to me, sort of instinctually, I think of liberals and Democrats as being the traditional free speech, champions, but that's not always true. It's not necessarily true. And certainly with the Biden administration, you even identified that this is a law that came to be during his administration. And since then, the Trump administration has not necessarily been friendly at all to free speech. So I agree that it is bipartisan, and it is really an issue of rule of law and constitutional democracy.
What's so interesting about this particular law is that Donald Trump favored a ban on TikTok in the United States when he was president before.
Hmm.
Since has changed his mind. Joe Biden favored and signed this law. Both Democrats and Republicans in Congress supported this law,
Hmm.
and the Supreme Court 9-0 upheld it. So there wasn't an ideological division there. So
Right.
I think that this issue transcends ideological divisions.
Hmm.
Generally, my response to what you say is I think the impulse of people is to want to stop the speech they don't like.
Right.
We've seen conservatives sometimes do this. We've seen liberals sometimes do this. And this has been an impulse that's long been there on the part of people who want to stop the expression they dislike. But I think what the First Amendment's all about is that we protect all ideas and views, the ones we like and the ones we dislike.
Right. Of course. And our own, personal commitments to that principle are certainly tested when we hear speech that we consider to be offensive. But, the sort of the idea underpinning the First Amendment, or at least sort of highly associated with it, is, well, more speech. More speech is the solution, not a restriction of speech. If we don't like it, if it hurts, if it's painful, if we have a visceral reaction to it, well, that should be channeled perhaps into, other speech or counterpoint speech rather than suppressing others' speech.
I think that's right. I think what underlies the First Amendment is a tremendous distrust on government power.
Sure.
I want the government to be tell us what messages we can hear or what we can say. And part of what bothers me with regard to the TikTok ban is it is the government using its power to eliminate a medium of communication that such a large number of people use. And my criticism of the Supreme Court's decision is it uncritically accepted the government's claim that if TikTok is operated by a Chinese owned company, the government of China can gather information about people in the United States and what they're viewing on TikTok. It's
Right.
certainly possible that the government of China could gather information from ByteDance about what people are watching on TikTok. The step in the argument that's missing to me is, and how will China knowing what dance videos people are watching on TikTok harm national security? There has been throughout American history an unfortunate tendency of the Supreme Court to uncritically accept claims of national security by the federal government. And I think that's what the Supreme Court did here.
Sure, sure, and I know that in multiple articles you've written, certainly one was related to the appellate court opinion. It was right on the heels of that, and the other right on the heels of the Supreme Court opinion. Hmm. You do point out, what you mentioned here, that purported national security concerns are often thrown out without getting a high level of scrutiny as to the legitimacy or validity of those concerns by the court. And we know, just at this point, sort of, if we've paid attention, lawyers kind of understand that, certainly constitutional lawyers, but I think even, citizens and lay people understand that anytime we hear the federal government talking about national security in conjunction with a limitation of a civil liberty, I mean, that should raise flags that encourage, citizens and certainly lawyers as well to look with a high degree of scrutiny about the reality of those national security claims. And you're right, this wasn't really addressed with any and I have to be careful using the word scrutiny because now we're invoking perhaps, in terms of art, in terms of strict scrutiny versus rational basis or intermediate basis. But yeah, the national security concerns, if they're not fleshed out, are hypothetical and can very easily and are in fact pretextual at many times.
I agree. The United States government made two arguments to support the ban on TikTok. One is that China could try to influence attitudes in the United States by the content on TikTok. The Supreme Court did not accept that argument. And I think it's a good thing because we don't stop speech because it might change minds.
Right.
In fact, if the government could prohibit China from doing that, could it stop Pravda from being sold in the United States? Could it stop any foreign government or any foreign company from engaging in speech? The assumption of the First Amendment is that more speech is better, regardless of the speaker or the source. And so the Court of Appeals accepted that government justification. The Supreme Court did not, and it was clear it was not. But the other justification given by the government is the one that I mentioned that we were just talking about, that if TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, the Chinese government can gather information about what people are watching or posting, what things on TikTok.
Mhm.
I'll grant the premise, but I don't understand how it harms national security for China to know or anybody to know who's watching what on TikTok.
Right, and there was no obvious exploration of that, and also, this TikTok, criticism or concern over TikTok uh, expressed by government officials is not new. And you mentioned there's a history, and Trump has even commented on it before and taken positions on it before. We know that our, these social media applications harvest a lot of data. The principal purpose purportedly is for marketing, and certainly the business models of the other applications, indicate that's true to some degree. But there is no, as you mentioned or related to that, there is no indication that this application is doing anything different than Facebook or Instagram, which are both Meta, or Twitter or other applications.
I think that's right. And I wish the Supreme Court, if it was going to rely on this rationale, had explained how does it harm national security for TikTok to be owned by a Chinese company.
Mhm.
Instead, what the Supreme Court did was uncritically accept the government's assertion. And that's what it's done too often in the past, suppressed rights based on unsupported allegations that national security is implicated.
Right, and that I think was the headline or title of your post Supreme Court treatment of the issue, something along the lines of SCOTUS failed to address whether Chinese access to TikTok data is a real national security threat. And then when you had written previously about the appellate court opinion, the DC appellate court, And you had a strong title. I'd like to ask you about it and kind of open the discussion up because the title is the free speech or the free speech implications of the coming ban on TikTok in the United States are staggering and unprecedented. Maybe we should spend a few minutes talking about, what do you mean by that? Because that sounds like something that we should flesh out, and it is fleshed out in your article.
It goes to exactly what we were talking about a moment ago. TikTok is a medium used by 173 million people. There's nothing quite like it available to people in the United States. And so what I was talking about is how this would be an unprecedented restriction on the ability of people to receive information or the ability of people to express themselves and reach an audience.
Hmm. Right. It might be worthwhile to spend, very briefly to talk about some First Amendment basics, just to orient, our lay people and certainly even some of the lawyers in the conversation. Um, one of the issues, and this might be a way to get into it, one of the issues are, content and speaker neutral legislation, which actually provides a little bit of a conceptual hook or trick or nuance in the analysis of this. It makes it kind of tougher sometimes to get well, it makes it tougher to maintain the free speech right, really, because there's less scrutiny on that, right?
Yes, the Supreme Court has said that speaker-based restrictions on expression generally violate the First Amendment. And this has come about especially in cases involving the right of corporations to engage in speech. The
Mhm.
Supreme Court has said that a corporation has the same right as individuals to engage in expression.
Citizens United.
Citizens United, and before that, a case First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti in
Right.
1978. Why do we protect the right of corporations to speak? Why do we protect the right of corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money from corporate treasuries in elections? And the Supreme Court's answer is that more speech is better, that we don't want the government to be able to single out speakers and silence them. Well, the
Right.
same thing would apply with regard to TikTok. If more speech is better, and if we don't want to silence particular speakers, then it's hard to reconcile the TikTok ban with those premises.
Definitely. And certainly the one of the government's arguments that was maybe the appellate court took it more seriously was than the Supreme Court, but the changing people's minds. I mean, just that without context. Well, sometimes we ought to change our minds when we become educated, learn more, have a higher consciousness of an issue. So the idea that Americans' minds might be changed by information, therefore it should be censored, that is it's antithetical to sort of a liberal democracy and enlightenment principles of human dignity and individual connection to, the broad, right?
And it's important that the Supreme Court did not accept that argument. It
Right.
wasn't a rationale that the court gave for upholding the TikTok ban. And I think the reason they didn't is just what you say, that there'd be no stopping point. I
Right.
mentioned even in the Cold War, Pravda was able to be sold in the United States.
Right.
Oxford University Press can sell books in this country, even if it's located in England. We don't restrict who can say what based on where they are in the world or what their views are.
Sure. I mean, it seems very paternalistic or kind of big brother or looking over our shoulder. It is not consistent with the classic sort of American liberal idea of intellectual freedom. Um, certainly, I mean, we can talk about and you can share a lot about what's going on, broadly on campus. I'm sure you have thoughts because I mean, I don't want to put a time frame on it, but certainly, recently and even during the Biden administration, there has been intense pressure on campuses to, I would say to silence and corral speech and to have the speech be quote unquote appropriate. And we see this, daily related to immigration issues. I mean, it's very due process, free speech. I mean, these are very core constitutional principles that are implicated by TikTok and the related sort of what I would call, um, a speech censorship sort of regime that's developing in some ways.
The core of the First Amendment is that all ideas and views can be expressed.
Hmm.
If there's any place where that is and should be true, it's on college campuses.
Sure.
Yet there's often the impulse to want to censor speech we don't like. In the early 1990s, over 360 college universities adopted hate speech codes. They
Mhm.
were well intentioned, but everyone to come to court was declared unconstitutional. Often they were declared unconstitutional as being unduly vague or overbroad.
Right.
Ultimately, they were unconstitutional because hateful speech is still expressing an idea or a viewpoint.
Hmm.
There have been efforts recently to try to stop speech that's critical of Israel, even anti Semitic, or speech that's seen as critical of Muslims or Islamophobic. But on a campus, all ideas and views can be expressed. And as you said earlier, the response to the speech we don't like should be more speech.
Sure. So you mentioned obviously there are some world events going on that kind of contribute, I think, politically to the impetus for some of these. I mean, I think without getting into great detail, there's of course the Missouri versus Biden case and opinions, and that had to do with the role generally of the federal government and applied or perceived pressure on tech companies and whether there were First Amendment issues there. But I only bring that up for purposes of identifying that the speech issues and censorship movements tend to be associated with things of major public concern. So, for example, those locusts would be like COVID, Russia, Ukraine, you know, what's going on in Gaza, Palestine, Israel right now. These seem to be focal points for some of the suppression. And I would kind of toss out there. It seems like, that for TikTok, there has for years been discussion about that, but it did seem like what's going on post October 7th led to, and it's, anything from Jonathan Greenblatt at ADL specifically identifying TikTok as a problem politically, for the pro-Israel group. I mean, that's just one example, but it seems like a lot of that is seems to me, and I'm not just saying it. There's been a lot of writing literature on it related to what's happening with Israel and Palestine momentarily.
And I think we have to follow the basic principles of the First Amendment. All ideas can be expressed, ideas that are supportive of Israel, ideas that are critical of Israel, even ideas that Israel should not exist as a Jewish state. There can also be speech that's praising of what Palestinians did, critical of what Palestinians done. Speech praising of Hamas is protected by the First Amendment, as well as speech that's deeply critical of Hamas. That's what the First Amendment is about. And what we have to resist is the impulse to try to stop or punish the speech that we disagree with.
Sure, sure. That's a tough principle, right? Because every individual has to wrestle with the uncomfortability, discomfort of hearing things we don't like that may fill us with some, feeling of real anger. But I think we also have to realize that the solution is not to quiet people through government action, but to have a more enlightened, democracy through real discussion.
If speech had no effects, we wouldn't protect it as a fundamental right.
Right,
There's
right,
no assurance that the effects will be positive.
right.
The effects can be very negative.
Mhm.
Speech can cause great harms. And yet, once we give the government the power to say some ideas can be expressed, but other ideas can't be expressed, then we've really gone a long way towards the path towards totalitarianism. And what I always say is, I know that the only way that my speech will be protected today is to fight to safeguard the speech that I dislike right now.
Absolutely, and that's yeah, and that's tough to do that. It's tough to bring yourself or ourselves to defend speech that we don't like. It's sort of a classic example, and I was very lucky to have this gentleman on this program a while ago, David Goldberger, who with the
Sure.
ACLU, he as someone in the Jewish community defended the right of the whatever it was called, the American National Socialists, Nazis, basically,
Right.
Nazis, to march in Skokie, which is a heavily Jewish community. what a profound statement of faith in the importance of the First Amendment. Truly, that's an example, I think, a classic example of what we're talking about.
And he was absolutely right.
Yeah.
The ACLU nationally lost a third of its members at the time that it was representing the Nazis' right to march in Skokie.
Mhm.
That's exactly what the ACLU was there for.
Right.
And so I might detest the things that Mahmoud Khalil said at Columbia, but it's wrong to punish him and try to deport him because of the views that he expressed. It
Mhm.
doesn't protect Jewish people or deal with anti-Semitism to try to silence those who are expressing views that we dislike.
Yeah, that's completely true. In fact, one could make the argument, I won't get into detail here, but it could actually have the opposite effect. That's not the basis for the idea and the rule, but it's got practical thing that we should be aware of also. But certainly if we want to have, information is what the oxygen lifeblood of democracy, and we can't have the government. Just practically, it makes sense. People should understand we can't have people who are in power telling us what we can and cannot think and hear.
That's right. And I want to be clear that that doesn't mean that free speech is absolute.
Right.
All heard the famous quote from the late Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes: "There's no right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater."
Right.
There are types of speech, incitement of illegal activity, child
Sure.
pornography, true threats that aren't protected.
Sure.
There can, of course, be time, place, and manner restrictions for good speech.
Right.
One is the right to come into my classroom and shout so that I can't teach.
Sure.
College and universities can restrict demonstrations near classroom buildings while classes are in session.
Yeah.
Not taking an absolute position. The only thing that is clear is that speech can't be punished just because of its idea or its viewpoint, even if we find the idea or viewpoint offensive.
Right. Very important point to conclude on. We're very close to the end here, so I'll just kind of wrap up by saying, yep, certainly some, and we can get another program when we need more time to get into the different types of speech. But sometimes speech can be like shouting fire in a movie theater. That's an action that puts people in danger. So it's not about the idea or what's being communicated there, right? So it's a very important point to bring up that it's not absolute. But yes, I mean, with that, I mean, we're really running out of time. Do you have a very brief closing thought as we conclude here?
I would just emphasize what we've been talking about, why free speech is so important for being a democracy and for all of our lives. A lot of people learn valuable information from TikTok that they use.
Sure,
There's also a lot of bad stuff probably on TikTok, but
sure.
that's the nature of the First Amendment. And to me, what was so troubling about the federal law and about the Supreme Court upholding it is it didn't focus on the speech consequences of banning TikTok. That said, it's astounding that you have a law that was adopted in a bipartisan way, upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court, and the president just says, "I'm suspending it." I
Right.
can't think of an analog to that either.
Sure. There's a lot about that that's unique. But thank you very much for being with us here, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of View in the Law.